The Vatican stood like a silent sentinel under the faint glow of dawn, its ancient stone walls whispering secrets of centuries past. Inside a modest chapel tucked beside St. Peter's Basilica, Pope Francis knelt alone, his frail frame trembling beneath the weight of his white robes. The air was cold, the silence broken only by the soft flicker of a dozen candles casting golden shadows across the room. His breathing was labored now, each inhale a quiet battle, each exhale a surrender to the inevitable. The doctors had been blunt. His illness was advancing, a relentless tide eroding the shores of his life. But Pope Francis didn't see this as defeat. No, in his heart, this was God's final gift to him, a test of endurance, a chance to prove his faith one last time. His hands, wrinkled and trembling from years of service, clutched a worn rosary, the beads polished smooth by decades of prayer. He closed his eyes and a flood of memories washed over him. The slums of Buenos Aires where he'd once walked barefoot with the poor, the war-torn villages where he'd knelt to kiss the feet of refugees, the countless nights he'd spent pleading with the world to choose love over hate. "Lord," he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion, "if these are my last days, let me use them to carry your light just a little longer." Tears welled in his eyes, not from fear, but from a bittersweet gratitude. He wasn't alone. He felt the presence of something divine, as if angels were brushing their wings against his soul. Pope Francis refused to let his fading body silence his mission. A few days later, he sat at a small weathered desk in his private quarters, the kind of desk that had seen countless prayers and sleepless nights. His hand shook as he dipped a pen into ink, the effort draining what little strength he had left. He was writing a letter, not just any letter, but a sacred testament meant for his closest confidants, the cardinals who'd stood by him and the leaders of a fractured world. This wasn't a goodbye. It was his last desperate plea to humanity, a love letter to a planet teetering on the edge. "My dearest friends," he began, his handwriting shaky but resolute, "we all know how fragile time is, how it slips through our fingers like sand. I feel it now, more than ever. But I'm not afraid. This is not an end, but a doorway. I write to you because our world stands at a breaking point. Wars tear families apart, greed poisons our souls, and despair chokes the hope we once held so dear. Yet I beg you, don't give up. Peace is still possible. Mercy can heal us. Faith can lift us from the ashes." The words poured out like a river, each one a piece of his heart. He wrote of the children he'd seen orphaned by conflict, their eyes haunting him still. He wrote of the earth, groaning under the weight of humanity's neglect, pleading for care. He wrote of forgiveness, of bridges built where walls once stood. By the time he finished, the page was stained with a single tear that had fallen mid-sentence. "God," he murmured, folding the letter with trembling hands, "let these words touch them. Let them feel what I feel." He handed it to a trusted cardinal, his voice barely a whisper. "Keep this safe until I'm gone. Then share it with the world." But this letter was only the beginning. While the globe buzzed with rumors about his failing health, newsrooms speculating, headlines screaming, Pope Francis made a choice that stunned even his inner circle. He would speak to the people one last time. The decision came late one night as he lay awake staring at the ceiling, his chest tight with pain. "They need to hear it from me," he told himself. "One more time, I'll stand for them." The day arrived, cold and gray, with heavy clouds hanging over Vatican City like a shroud. St. Peter's Square was a sea of humanity, thousands of pilgrims, locals, and visitors from every corner of the earth, their faces a tapestry of hope, worry, and faith. They'd come to see their shepherd, clutching rosaries, holding signs that read, "We love you, Francis," their voices rising in soft hymns carried by the wind. When Pope Francis appeared, wheeled out onto the balcony in a simple chair, a hush fell over the crowd. He looked fragile, his face pale and gaunt, but his eyes, they burned with a fire that no illness could dim. He took the microphone, his hand shaking but his grip firm. The world watched, live on every channel, every screen as he began to speak. "If these are my final words," he said, his voice soft yet piercing, "I want you to know that I've spent my life as your servant, your brother, your friend, but today I'm asking something of you." The crowd leaned in, hanging on every syllable, their breath visible in the chilly air. "We're standing at a crossroads," he continued, his voice rising with a strength that seemed to defy his body. "Humanity is hurting. Our children go hungry while bombs fall. Our rivers dry up while we chase wealth. Our hearts harden while we turn away from each other. I've seen it all, the pain, the loss, the fear. But I've also seen the beauty, a mother's sacrifice, a stranger's kindness, a sinner's redemption. And I'm telling you now it's not too late. Silence the guns. Feed the hungry. Open your arms to the stranger. Love, above all, love, because that's the only thing that lasts." Tears streamed down his face as he spoke, and the crowd wept with him. A little girl in the front row clutched her mother's hand, her sobs echoing in the stillness. An old man dropped to his knees, praying aloud. Pope Francis paused, struggling to breathe, his chest heaving with effort. But he wasn't done. "I've made mistakes," he confessed, his voice breaking. "I've stumbled, doubted, fallen short. But every time God lifted me up, and He'll lift you too. So please, my family, don't let go of hope. Don't let go of each other." When he finished, he bowed his head, letting the microphone fall gently to his lap. The square was silent. No applause, no cheers, just a sacred stillness, as if the earth itself had paused to mourn and marvel. People clung to one another, strangers embracing like kin, their faces wet with tears. On screens worldwide, the image lingered. Pope Francis, small and broken yet towering in spirit, a man who'd given everything he had left. As he was wheeled back inside, the crowd remained frozen, unwilling to let the moment slip away. Some whispered prayers, others stood in awe, their hands pressed to their hearts. News anchors stumbled over their words, unable to capture the magnitude of what they'd witnessed. Historic, they called it, but that felt too small. This was more a soul laid bare, a cry that pierced the heavens. Inside the Vatican, Pope Francis collapsed into a chair, exhausted but at peace. A young priest knelt beside him, holding his hand. "Holy Father," he said softly, "you've changed us today." Francis smiled weakly, his eyes distant. "No, my son," he replied. "God did that. I just spoke the words." Days later, the news broke. Pope Francis had slipped away quietly in his sleep, his rosary still tangled in his fingers. The world mourned. Church bells tolled, flags flew at half-mast, and millions gathered to say goodbye. But then came the letter. The cardinal, tears in his eyes, unsealed it before a hushed assembly of leaders and broadcast it live to the world. As the words were read aloud, people stopped in their tracks, on streets, in homes, in war zones, listening to the Pope's final plea. "Fight for peace," it urged. "Protect the weak, heal the earth, love without limits." Leaders bowed their heads, some openly weeping as they realized the weight of their choices. Protests for peace erupted in cities worldwide, inspired by a man who'd never carried a weapon but wielded compassion like a sword. Children planted trees in his name, families reconciled, and strangers shared meals, all because of a letter written by a dying man who refused to give up on humanity. In St. Peter's Square, a single candle burned where he'd last spoken, surrounded by flowers and handwritten notes. "Thank you, Francis. You showed us the way." His body was gone, but his spirit lingered. In every tear shed, every hand extended, every heart softened. Pope Francis hadn't just said goodbye, he'd ignited a revolution of the soul, a legacy that would echo through generations. And somewhere, in the quiet of eternity, he smiled, knowing his final test had been passed and his love had won.